Thank you. Without further ado, Professor Kevin Hetherington, Deputy Vice-Chancellor, will introduce Richard and his lecture.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Staffordshire University. It's very good to see you all here today. And as well as the people in the room, we are also live streaming this on YouTube, so we are obviously being viewed and got participants from across the world, I'm sure. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Richard Cook, who is going to be giving tonight's inaugural lecture. Richard is Professor of Health Psychology in the School of Health Science and Wellbeing here at Staffordshire University, and he is also a registered health psychologist. Richard is recognised as an internationally leading scholar on psychological predictors of alcohol consumption and the design and evaluation of health behaviour change interventions. Richard's research is interdisciplinary in nature and has involved collaboration with researchers based in Australia, Europe and North America. He's published over 70 peer-reviewed outputs, delivered numerous invited and keynote talks both nationally and internationally, and has written policy responses on behalf of the British Psychological Society. He also acted as standing chair of the Scientific Committee for the 2022 and 2023 Division of Health Psychology annual conferences, and was the lead editor for the Palgrave Handbook of Psychological Perspectives on Alcohol Consumption, which was published in 2021. I'm going to hand over to Richard in a moment, and he is going to take some questions at the end of his talk. And the title of that talk is, and you can see it behind me, Thinking About Drinking, What Psychology Can Tell Us About Why People Drink Alcohol. Richard, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you all for coming along today. It's my great pleasure to give this talk today. So, without further ado, thank you, Mike. Okay, so the talk is in three parts, which quite neatly map onto my academic career. The first part of the talk is a reflection of my early career, where I used health psychology theories to predict university students' binge drinking. In the mid part of my career, I went on to think about broader issues, very specifically around alcohol policy. And then the final part of the talk is about my current collaborations and future plans. Next slide, please. If that works, there we go. Okay, so I think it's a good thing to do in a keynote to look back on where you've come from and where you currently are. And so I thought I'd share with you some pictures of me as I progressed through my academic career. So I started out doing a PhD in social psychology at the University of Sheffield between 1999 and 2002. I then moved on to the University of Leeds, where I worked as a postdoctoral research fellow for about 10 months, and then I took up my first academic post as a temporary lecturer in health psychology at Sheffield Hallam University. I then made a very, very good move to Aston University in September 2004, where I worked as a permanent lecturer in health psychology for about 8 years before getting promoted to senior lecturer in health psychology. And I moved to the University of Liverpool as a senior lecturer in psychology in 2018 and was there for 4 years before moving to Staffordshire in January 2022. So it's been about 2 years since I've been at Staffordshire, and you can see there I've changed quite a lot over those years. So next slide, please. Okay. So this one's for my son, William, and he's going to count how many times I say health psychology throughout the talk. So that's his thing that will keep him amused while we're talking. So many of you in the room won't know what health psychology is or have any sort of understanding of what that is. So I thought it was important to start with a bit of a definition. So this comes from the Division of Health Psychology's webpage. I'm a full member of the division, and their quote is this: "The goal of health psychology is to study the psychological processes underlying health, illness, and healthcare, and to apply these findings to the promotion and maintenance of health, the analysis and improvement of the healthcare system and health policy formation, the prevention of illness, disability, and the enhancement of outcome for those who are ill or disabled." So the short answer to that is health psychologists do a lot of different things. Next slide, please. And what I want to do here in this slide is just highlight what I've done as a health psychologist with regard to alcohol. So I've done quite a lot of other things in that definition, but more specifically applied to alcohol. My early work was focusing on studying the psychological processes underlying health. So I was very interested in health behaviours because those are a key determinant of a person's health. And then I kind of migrated into looking at health policy and how you might change that. So next slide, please. So as part of my reflection on my time as an academic, I dug out one of my very first slides I created for the course I taught at Aston on health psychology theories. And this is the biopsychosocial model of health. It is an attempt to capture all the things that influence people's health in the world. And it's in contrast to a very dominant model within other disciplines, the biomedical model, which suggests that the primary determinant of a person's health is kind of whether or not they're biologically healthy, if you will. So if somebody has damage to something like their organs or tissues or cells, then they won't feel as healthy as somebody who doesn't have that damage. Now, without wishing to downplay that, this model says that there's a lot more to health than just biology. So we can think about social systems. So we know that our friends and family influence our health, the community around us can influence our health, and society more broadly. So there is some really nice work done on surgery recovery, which shows that people who perceive more social support than people who perceive less social support, they actually recover from surgery quicker. And the reality is, that fascinates me as a psychologist, is that they don't necessarily have any more social support, but if they perceive it, they recover quicker. So I think there's a lot of very important stuff goes on in the world around us. Now, the other aspect, of course, the one that perhaps most important to me is our psychological systems, so our experiences and behaviour. And these three things have all been the focus of the early part of my career. Our emotions, so how we feel about things, our cognitions, our thoughts about behaviours around us, and most importantly to me, our motivation. So why is it that people do certain things and don't do others? When I started out as an academic, as a PhD student, we were applying this logic very, very generally. We were almost ignoring behaviours and just focusing on the principles of the theory. Can we test the theory? Do we get this effect everywhere? Now, that was okay when I started out, but when I moved into working on alcohol, I thought, no, I want to kind of carve out a niche and work in a particular area, which was looking at why people engage in alcohol consumption. So that's kind of why the talk has the title it does. Next slide, please. So what you often do as an academic is you look at a problem in the real world and think, okay, can I try and help explain this a little bit? So this is data from 2006, and these are bars representing the percentages of people at different age groups engaging in what's called binge drinking. So the definition of binge drinking is highly contested, and we'll get to a definition later on in the talk. But for now, all you really need to know is how many people were drinking this way at certain age groups. So hopefully that graph's clear enough showing you that there's an age effect here. So the youngest age groups are engaging in the most binge drinking effectively, and then this tails off as people age. So I had a real world problem to try and explain why are adolescents, young adults, university students mostly, engaging in this behaviour. Now, to take a slight sidestep, within my PhD, as I've already said, there was a general interest in models and theories of motivation. And these will be applied to kind of any behavior you can imagine. There was a massive glut of research in this area at that time. And some of the health behaviors people were interested in were things like physical activity or fruit and vegetable intake. And of course, there was a little bit of work on binge drinking, but there wasn't a tremendous amount. There was a couple of studies, but not a lot. So I thought, well, this might be the one that I'm interested in. Now, the next slide is for my colleagues who are health psychologists who have seen this diagram many, many times before. So this is one of the theories that health psychologists were using to try and explain behavioral phenomena. So in essence, if you want to predict somebody's behavior, you measure their intentions, plans, or goals to perform the behavior. And if you want to measure their intentions, you want to predict their intentions, you measure their attitudes, subjective norms, and perceived control. Now, certainly some of the audience, some of my ex-Aston colleagues will have seen me give this talk many, many times before. So I decided that, because it's a keynote, I would change things up a little bit. So here is my attempt to graphically represent the theory of planned behavior, which hopefully is a lot more appealing to look at than that very, very dry diagram. Now, according to this theory, it's got quite a simple premise. if you want to predict whether somebody's going to end up in the pub or drink alcohol, you ask them, do you plan to do it? Do you have the goal to drink alcohol? Do you intend to do it? And that's the essence of the theory. And if you want to predict somebody's intentions, you then measure three things: their attitudes towards the behavior, their subjective norms about behavioral performance, and their perceptions of behavioral control about that behavior as well. Now, I guess most of you know what an attitude is, but simply put, in this theory, it's your positive or negative evaluations of performing the behavior, whether you think drinking alcohol is a good thing or a bad thing, in simple terms. The other two constructs are probably less familiar, but subjective norms are meant to represent perceptions of social approval or disapproval, hence the thumbs up, thumbs down, from important others, your friends and family. So if all your friends think binge drinking is a good idea, that's social approval. If all your family think it's a bad idea, that's social disapproval. And the final construct is perceptions of behavioral control, which is whether you believe the behavior is actually under your control or not. Now, you might be surprised to hear this, you might not, but humans have a massive tendency to overestimate how much control they have over behavior. And in alcohol, this effect seems to be amplified to a very high level. So people will routinely tell me in questionnaire studies, oh yes, it's fully under my control, and they'll tell me they're not going to drink very much. And then you ask them a few days later, and they're like, yeah, I don't know, somebody twisted my arm. So those perceptions aren't always very accurate. And that's why you have a dotted line at the bottom of the diagram, because the dotted line represents the extent to which your perceptions reflect actual control. That's the most technical thing I'll say in the talk, so don't worry, there's not too much more theory after that. Now, in terms of what I do as a researcher, my methodology is fairly straightforward as well. I create surveys that have measures of those constructs, intentions, attitudes, etc. And then I give those questions to people, ask them to complete them, given the extent of how strongly they agree with the statements or disagree with them. And then about a week later, or sometimes several weeks later, I'll ask them to complete something like a drinks diary to tell me how much they drank over a week or on a particular occasion. And what you find is if you run statistical analysis, you can see whether there's evidence for those relationships or not. And that's basically what I do as a researcher. Now, a good example of that is the first paper I published on alcohol when I moved to Aston, which was a collaboration with this guy here. This is Professor Falco Schneehotter, who's at the University of Heidelberg. Back then, he was at the University of Aberdeen. Now, as a good academic, when you change jobs, this is what you should do. You should go on all your induction training, be fully up to speed with everything that you do, read your entirely large booklet of information that the university give you. What you shouldn't do is hot step it to Helsinki to go to a conference. I went to Helsinki, and for me, this was fantastic because if I hadn't gone to Helsinki, if I'd done the right thing and stayed at home and done all my induction, I wouldn't have got chatting to Falco. And now Falco was presenting at the same conference, it's a European Health Psychology Society conference, and we talked, or maybe I talked him into collecting a bunch of data for me in Aberdeen, which was great because he did all the work and I got quite a lot of the credit. So I definitely recommend this in the future if you want to pursue an academic career. So what were we trying to do? Here's the theory again, explaining graphically. So we measured the things on the left-hand side and in the middle. We measured intentions, attitudes, norms, and PPC. And then a week later, we sent the same participants this drinks diary, and we wanted to see if there was any evidence for the theory based on what participants reported in the surveys. Now, I could have used lots and lots of correlations and various things here, but I thought it'd be easier just to use ticks and crosses. So basically, we found some support for the theory in terms of intentions predicting behavior. So people who said they were going to drink usually ended up binge drinking, and those people who said they didn't usually ended up not binge drinking. So that's good. That supports what the theory is proposing. Similarly, we found attitudes did predict people's intentions. So again, further support for the theory. Now, the other three pathways were not supported by the evidence. So norms didn't predict intentions, perceived control did not predict intentions or behavior. And I think the perceived control effects were largely because when we looked at the results that participants gave us, they were reporting that they had almost limitless control over their drinking, which of course is a bit inaccurate, shall we say. Now, Falco collects the data, I wrote this up, we started sending off abstracts at conferences, and to my amazement, when you send off an abstract, sometimes the conference organisers will write back to you and say, yeah, this one's going to get press released. So I was actually getting some interest from the mainstream media, the highlight of which was an article written in Finnish. Now, my Finnish is not great, but I particularly like Google Translate's form of turning my name, Dr. Cook, into The Cook. And I've thought of myself as the cook ever since. So unfortunately, this is archived, so I can't use it to prove my point, but nevertheless. I also, for my sins, ended up in the staff university magazine, looking quite surly there, if I'm totally honest. It was quite cold. And after persuading the photographer that having a full pint of alcohol in a picture that all the staff, including the Vice-Chancellor, was going to see wasn't good for my career prospects, I thought, wow, I've made it. I'm doing quite well here. So it all seemed to work out quite well. Now, those of you who know me well will know that there's nothing like having multiple projects on the go at the same time. That keeps me quite engaged. So as well as also working with Falco, I was working with this chap. This is Professor David French, who's at the University of Manchester. And at the time, he was at the University of Birmingham and then at Coventry University. Now, David and I wanted to do a sort of similar study to what we did in Aberdeen, but in Birmingham. We really wanted to elicit the beliefs that were important to students about why they binge drink. So that's why it's called Understanding Beliefs for Developing Interventions. But alongside that, we also measured the same sort of variables that we measured in Aberdeen, so we can compare our results. Now, this is a bit of a crazy idea to psychologists, but replicating your findings is a good thing for science. So we can actually try and see whether we found something in one study, did we find the same sort of thing in another? And if we return to our graphic, what we found is there was actually evidence of consistent effects. So intentions predicted binge drinking again, attitudes predicted intentions, and perceived control was as hopeless as it was in virtually every study I've used it in, so it's just not very good. Now, the attentive on you will notice that there's a tick there that wasn't there before, which was that the subjective norms, the perceptions of approval or disapproval, did predict intentions in Birmingham, and that was in contrast to what we found in Aberdeen. So, all psychologists are fascinated, in my experience, by the question why. Why does stuff happen? Why do people binge drink? Why do you find one variable predicts an outcome in one context? Because you've got to bear in mind, the Aberdeen students and the Birmingham students are quite similar in many ways. It was a predominantly female sample. They were reporting high levels of binge drinking. And we could have just written off and say, well, they're Scottish and they're English. But that wouldn't get you very far. It doesn't really, promote an academic career. So David and I instead put our heads together and thought, well, what is it similar and different in terms of the methods we used in the two places? Because we measured things fairly similarly. We used the same theory, similar sample. And one of the things we stumbled upon was that in the Aberdeen data, the data was collected in a non-drinking context like this environment. So that's out there is more like a drinking context because you don't see people drinking, fewer people drinking in here. Whereas in Birmingham, purely by accident, serendipity, if you will, we'd actually got the students to complete the questionnaires as they entered the guild bar at the University of Birmingham. So David and I thought that maybe seeing people drinking or having other cues to drinking might have affected the responses. We've got to remember the measures are assessments of approval or disapproval for performing the behaviour. So if you see somebody doing a behaviour, you might perceive a lot of approval for it, whereas if you don't see anyone doing the behaviour, then maybe those cues aren't quite so salient. So this led to my favourite paper as an academic, the role of context and time frame in moderating relationships in the theory of fan behaviour. Now, if I had more time, I'd talk about time frame as well, because there's really interesting things there, but I'm going to focus on context today. So what does it mean to look at context? Well, we want to know if completing the same questionnaire in a drinking context, like a bar, would lead to different results than if you completed them in a neutral environment like the university library. Don't know how many libraries you've been to, but hopefully there's not too much drinking going on there. So we thought that that was a fairly safe environment. And for those of you who are interested, neither of these are real representations of the places we used. The University of Birmingham library got demolished, so having a picture of that was quite hard to source off the internet. These are just stock images of what libraries and bars look like. So we had an idea. Would where you complete the same measures affect the size of the relationships? And good news for us, the answer is yes. So although the relationship was significant in both contexts, it was significantly stronger in the drinking context than it was in the library. So this is all good. You've spent all this time theorizing, you've spent ages working on data collection, you've come up with a very specific, precise test, and you've actually got support for it. So well done us for sort of persisting on this. And you might think, well, why do all that? So the take-home message is where you ask people to complete measures of psychological predictors can affect their predictive ability. So theoretically, I think this is very, very important because what typically happens is people assess theories in non-drinking environments. So they might be missing a trick here because what's actually going on in a drinking environment, the patterns of prediction might be different. And yet that wealth of research that I thought would follow the publication of this paper has never materialized. I'm one of 2 other people who've done further studies using that method. But in an applied sense, how does this help us? Well, from my point of view, if you're interested in developing interventions to change behavior, the things you want to target, the predictors of that behavior, should be the things that actually predict it where it takes place. If you have a bunch of variables that predict something in a non-drinking environment, but not so much in a drinking environment, and then you target those in intervention, then you're probably less likely to change behavior than if you target the variables that are more important. So that methodological, the importance of using methodology to answer questions, I think is very, very key. Okay, so that's a bit about the start of my career. Moving on to talk a bit about broader picture, so something that affects anyone who drinks alcohol, alcohol policy. Now, luckily for me, when I was starting to work in this area, alcohol policy in England and Scotland was a really hot topic. It's not remained that way, but in the first decade of the 21st century, there were lots of policies on this in England and also a bit in Scotland. And it all got kicked off by the government. So this was a rare occasion of a government actually proposing that there's a problem and we need to do something about it, which our current government, I suspect, would probably not follow such an approach nowadays. But anyway, so the headline was, binge drinking costs the UK society £20 billion a year. And here is an infographic breaking down how that sort of pans out and how you get to £20 billion. So in response to this self-generated headline, the new Labour government published what's called the Alcohol Harm Reduction Strategy in 2004. And then 3 years later, they published Safe, Sensible and Social before what is in the running for the worst policy title in history, the government's alcohol strategy. I don't know how long they took to come up with that. Not very long, I would hope, but it's awful. The bad news from people in England's point of view is that this is the last published alcohol strategy in England. This was published in 2012 under the coalition government. We've had 0 alcohol policy in England. In Scotland, the situation different in Wales and Northern Ireland as well. Now, going back to the first of those policies, the Alcohol Harm Reduction Strategy, what did that policy say we should do? Because you've got this problem, binge drinking's affecting the economy and society. How do you stop it effectively? So one idea was to raise awareness of what's called sensible drinking, or what was called sensible drinking, among the general population. Now, it was a reasonable goal because people generally didn't know what sensible drinking was. Back then, sensible drinking was women drinking up to 3 units, not daily, that's what the alcohol industry want you to do, but no on a particular occasion, and then men no more than 4 units. And for those of you who are interested, we'll go through what units are in the next slide. And so you put all this information on products, and therefore you hopefully raise people's awareness of what sensible drinking is, because they go into shops, they buy these products, they see all these sorts of things. The other thing they did was an advertising campaign to try and raise awareness of the perils of binge drinking. So if the tech guys can play the video now.
Stand back.
Too much alcohol makes you feel invincible when you're most vulnerable.
So those of you who are health psychologists will recognize that immediately as a fear appeal with a very straightforward message there. Don't do this behavior, bad things will happen to you. And towards the end of the talk, I'll talk a little bit about why that approach doesn't seem to work very effectively. But nevertheless, that was kind of the nuts and bolts of this particular strategy. Raise awareness, scare people, and you'll change their behavior. Now, before we get on to the merits of that approach, I think that it's always important to educate people when you stand up and give a talk. And in my experience, many people are completely confused as to what a unit of alcohol is. So this handy infographic is there to help you out. The simplest one to get your head around is a single pub measured spirit. That's about 1 unit of alcohol. If you have a pint of beer, if it's regular beer, which is about 4% alcohol by volume, you're looking at around about 2 units. If it's 5%, which is sort of continental lagers often are, you're looking at 3 units. An alcopop is 1.5 units, or a can of lager. Now, the wine drinkers, you always get the worst end of the deal, I'm afraid. So if you go into a licensed premise and ask for a small glass of wine, that's about 2 units, 175 ml. And if you ask for a large glass of wine, that's actually 3 units. And your bottle of wine on the right-hand side is just 3 lots of 250 to get to your 750. So the guidelines, if I can make it go backwards, we can, yes, excellent. So the guidelines are effectively saying this: if you're a woman and you drink wine, you can drink 1 large glass of wine. That's it. That's sensible drinking. If you're a man and you drink beer, 2 pints of beer is your limit for sensible drinking. So I'll let that seep into the drinkers in the audience about whether that fits in with their pattern of alcohol consumption. But that was what the government was saying. We can take a position on whether that's a good idea or not. Where I started to get interested in this is the kind of nerdy side of things, the mathematics, the measurement side of things. So within the data we'd already collected in Aberdeen and Birmingham, we'd asked a bunch of other questions that weren't looking at theory, but we were looking at knowledge. And one of those questions was, how many units do students think binge drinking is? So we gave the students a lot of help. We gave them lots of information about the unit content of different drinks. And then we just had an open-ended response. How many think binge drinking is for a woman? How many units do you think it is for a man? The bars represent different things. So the pink bars represent what was then thought of as binge drinking in official reports, which is double those daily amounts. So 6 units for women, 8 units for men. I don't have time to go into this in huge detail, but hopefully that graph will emphasize that our participants, whether male or female, whether asked about males or females, were consistently overestimating what binge drinking was in unit terms. Now, there's good reasons for that. The government have decided, probably quite smartly, that giving people an actual definition, rather than hiding it in official reports that no one reads, would leave it, people would have then this goal to go binge drinking. If you told them there were 6 or 8 units, then they'd use that as a goal for a night out. I would argue that actually that absence of knowledge is leading to people thinking that their own behaviour is actually okay when they're actually drinking quite a lot more. And we'll return to this topic later on in the talk when we talk about some data from the Global Drug Survey. So this kind of like general idea around units. And then kind of the next thing I did was go to another conference. Obviously, there's a theme in this talk. So this conference was even better. This was in Pisa in September in 2009. And my friend, Alison Wright, got given what's known as the graveyard slot at the European Health Psychology Society, which is Saturday morning for any of you who've ever been to that conference. Now, why is that the graveyard slot? Most people have gone home. So poor old Alison had her talk to do, and she said, please come. And luckily for her and me, my flight wasn't until later on in the day. So I said, I'll come along and listen to your talk, which was very, very good. At the end of her session was this guy, Dr. Richard DeVissa, and he was giving a really interesting talk about alcohol. And I hadn't planned to go to this talk or anything. Since then, I've searched through conference programs looking for the word alcohol to find all the alcohol talks so I don't miss another really good one. What Richard had done in his study is to ask adolescents and university students to pour their usual drink in plastic versions of pint glasses, wine glasses, that sort of thing. And then, because he's like me and he's a bit nerdy, he then measured out how many units there are. So if you want to calculate the units in a drink, it's quite an easy calculation. For those of you who like to do your sums, what you do is you measure the volume of the alcohol and then you multiply by the alcohol by volume. So like 4% for beer, 14% for wine. And then you divide that value by 1,000. It will tell you how many units there are. So Richard did all of that for several hundred students. He probably got his student to do it for him, actually, but nevertheless. And he came up with this really interesting finding that when people were asked to pour their usual drink, they were always drinking more than 1 unit. Now, I don't think this was deliberate. We didn't ask them to do that. And in another part of the study, he did ask them to pour a unit, and they were quite good at that task. But again, we've got this emphasis that people are perhaps drinking more than they realise. And that could come back to an issue about lack of awareness of what the guidelines are, which is what the policy said in the first place. So, after a few more years, Richard and I got chatting about doing a study together, looking at this idea of whether you could increase unit awareness of drinking and whether by doing that you would actually reduce alcohol consumption. Because the policy says one of the reasons why people drink too much is they're just not aware how many units there are in what they drink. And once they're magically informed of this information, they'll drink less because they want to be sensible drinkers. So we did an experiment to test this idea. In working with Brighton City Council, we got a whole bunch of what are called unit mark glasses, which are shown on the slide. So on one side, it tells you how many units are the recommendations for men and women, and on the back, it shows the content in terms of like how much you're pouring, how many units that are. That's why they're unit mark glasses. So we recruited a sample of middle-aged drinkers and sent half of them one of these glasses and said, please use this for about a month. And then the other half didn't get the glass. And so before they'd been sent the glass, we'd asked them to report their unit, knowledge and awareness, and also how much they drunk. After they'd used the glasses for a while, repeated the survey, how much did you drink? What's your unit, knowledge and awareness? Now, on the first point that we were testing, we were actually successful, which was great. We actually managed to increase unit awareness in our sample that used the glass, which potentially is an amazing outcome. These are extremely cheap things to manufacture. There were just a bunch lying around in Brighton City Council that they'd use for health promotion. So in terms of scaling this up, it would be very, very easy to do if it was shown to be an effective strategy for reducing alcohol consumption. Unfortunately, what we found was it had no impact. Using the glasses had no impact on alcohol consumption in this sample. So the take-home message from that study is that increasing awareness of drinking guidelines does not necessarily reduce people's alcohol consumption. So it's one thing to say there's a problem. It's another thing to say this is how we solve it. But then the next step, from my point of view as a researcher, is you test that approach. Does that approach hold up? And if you can manipulate a factor, but it doesn't change your outcome, then you probably need to change something else if you're going to be honest about bringing about change. Okay, so that's a bit about the sort of early and middle points of my career. Now I want to move on to the present day and talk about current collaborations and future plans. So between the conference in Pisa and working with Richard on the Unimar glasses, I got together with this guy in the top right. This is Professor Charles Abraham, University of Exeter. And we got funding from the Division of Health Psychology to run a one-day workshop at Aston University where we basically just invited a bunch of UK psychologists who were interested in alcohol for this event. And we spent the morning talking about their outcomes, their research, and then we spent the afternoon talking about grant proposals. So Charles is in the top right, bottom left to me. So on your far right, that's Nick Heather, who's a very eminent alcohol researcher. There's Richard. Next to him is David Foxcroft, who's at Oxford Brookes University. Below him is Paul Norman, who was my PhD supervisor. And to your left, that's Emma Davis, who I'll talk a bit about more. She was doing her PhD at the time. Now, one of the great things about workshops is when you get a bunch of clever people together and talk about things, you usually come up with some really good ideas. So my really good idea at the end of the workshop was, well, we've got this data in Aberdeen and Birmingham, but wouldn't it be better to get data from all over the country and see whether you find the same things and see whether the same predictors are important everywhere? Because Nick had done a really nice study showing there were geographical differences in the amount of alcohol harms reports. And I thought, well, I want to do a predictive version of that study. Now, as any academic in the audience will know, best intentions and all that, that study still hasn't happened, but instead, Richard and I got talking about doing a European version of that study. So the idea for that was, we were well aware, most people in the audience I'm sure are aware of the fact that there are cultural practices when it comes to alcohol. You might not call it that, but people drink differently in different countries effectively. This screenshot from the Metro is effectively saying that people in Britain drink more alcohol and more frequently than people in France, Italy, Spain, Germany, and America. The colourful graphic up there is showing that people drink different types on average. So you get your Southern European countries, the average preference is for wine, sort of Western and Northern countries like beer, that's the yellow one, and then the Scandinavians apparently prefer spirits along with former Eastern European countries. My experience of Scandinavians, they like beer too. But nevertheless, that's the kind of idea. You have these different cultures of drinking practice. So the things that I'm interested in as a psychologist, people's beliefs, their motivation, they are all shaped, according to the biopsychosocial model, by the world around us. So if I grow up in Portugal, my beliefs might be different to growing up in England. And that's kind of one of the things we're interested in. Now, further evidence of these differences comes from the final picture, which comes from the brilliant SPAD survey. So this is a survey done every 4 years of adolescents in lots of different European countries. And they're asked a very simple question: have you engaged in binge drinking in the last 30 days? And what you find is that certain countries, hint, one's in red, their rate of binge drinking is quite a lot higher than countries that are in green. So England and Portugal are quite different in their patterns there. So Richard and I applied for funding from the European Research Advisory Board and to do a study in the countries that are marked in the graphic. We recruited people from academics from different countries: Franco Beccaria from Italy, Erta Scholz from Switzerland, Jakob de Mant from Denmark. There's Richard, and that's Lena Flegg, who's in Germany. And we also got very, very lucky because we had a brilliant postdoc, Maria Fernandez Jesus, who was from Portugal. And we set out to compare results across these different countries. And this led to a series of publications. The one that I first authored was basically showing that patterns of alcohol harm varied across different countries. So Northern European countries report higher levels of harm in their university students relative to university students in those other countries. Maria did an amazing paper comparing the validity of different measures in different countries. And then finally, Richard did a nice paper about policies. The take-home message of that is any policy that tries to restrict access to alcohol isn't very popular. So policymakers are onto a loser anyway. There's no way over here. So now, again, as I was working on this project, I was also starting to collaborate with Emma Davis, who's at Oxford Brookes University. Now, Emma has been working for many years on the Global Drug Survey, and brilliantly timed for me, this actually launched last week, so I can use the graphic for the current survey. Now, the Global Drug Survey is an attempt to capture substance users' perceptions of their drinking experiences and also other substance users as well. And Emma had a massive amount of input in how this was doing. And we got chatting about what data she already had, and we alighted on this interesting idea about subjective views about intoxication. So far I've talked about government guidelines, definitions like units and all that sort of thing. That's one way of defining your alcohol practice. Another way is to ask drinkers, what do you think? How much would you like to drink? And that's exactly what Emma did. So I take no credit for this. This is all her work. So she asked about 3 stages of intoxication. You can feel the effects, so you're starting to feel a bit of the effect of alcohol. Being as drunk as you would like to be, sweet spot, that's what we called that. And then the tipping point, starting to feel more drunk than you want to be. And anyone who's drunk in this room might have experienced the tipping point maybe just once, possibly, or a few times. Now, these are deliberately subjective. We're not interested in knowledge or awareness or any of that stuff I did with Richard. This is what are people's subjective perceptions of what they like to drink and how much are they drinking. So, again, Emma did all the hard work here. We had data from over 60,000 drinkers from across I think it was 17 different countries, so a wide range. And the y-axis here is the grams of alcohol they reported for the second question, as drunk as they would like to be, so the subjective sweet spot. And what you find there is, I guess most of you don't know what 100 or even 120 grams of alcohol is. To give you some context, the UK weekly drinking guidelines are 14 units a week. That's 112 grams of alcohol. So, in the Netherlands, for example, the average, which is what that red bar represents on the extreme right, amount of drink that drinkers reporting that they would drink to meet their desired level of intoxication on one drinking event is exceeding what the UK government recommends you drink in a week. Quite a big difference here. In fact, if you can see where it says 40 on the y-axis, that's where most governments would want people to be drinking on a single occasion. Now, there's a real lack of 40s here as averages, which does rather suggest that, and of course this is a substance use group, so they're perhaps heavier drinkers than a general population group, but nevertheless, there's a big disconnect between what the government is recommending people do and what people are reporting doing themselves. Since I've been at Staffordshire, I've started collaborating more with researchers in Scandinavia. So last year, I went to the University of the Arctic Circle in Tromsø in Norway to meet with Henriette, Geraldine and Roman. And what we were doing was a reanalysis of a study they'd done. They'd done this really nice paper looking at an intervention to prevent the onset of alcohol use in adolescents in Norway. And because they're Norwegians and they do these things very, very well, they'd measured the constructs I was interested in at the start of my career longitudinally. So most of the time, we measure the constructs once, we try and predict behavior. They'd measured the constructs 3 times. There were 6 months between the first measurement and another 12 months for the third measurement. This is kind of like amazing, basic stuff that we should be doing, but is rarely done. You usually have to get a large-scale funded trial to do that. So we're analysing that data now because as adolescents age, they become more likely to drink. So we want to see if there's a parallel increase in their beliefs, and the early sense is there is. So we can then potentially go back to get further funding to see whether we can intervene to delay the onset, because we know that the later you start drinking, the better your health outcomes are. This is my ex-PhD student, Joel Crawford, who I supervise at the University of Liverpool, who's now at the magnificently titled University of Linköping in Sweden. And Joel's PhD was about the fear of missing out. So what's the fear of missing out? Well, he created a vignette so I don't have to do too much work here. So effectively, you have your very diligent student here stressing out about an assignment, and they receive a picture telling them everyone else is having a party. Now, if you're bothered about that picture, you're experiencing the fear of missing out because you're sitting there doing the right thing by, getting good grades and, getting a great job at the end of the day, obviously, when you could be out partying with all your friends. And Joel looked at this phenomena, and this takes us a little bit back to the health video I showed you, because the video is effectively saying, if we highlight all the regrets people experience through drinking, they won't drink as much. And what Joel found when he interviewed drinkers, University of Liverpool students, is that they say they would rather suffer all the negative health consequences, blackouts, falling over, vomiting, hangovers, than experience the fear of missing out. That's how dangerous or how aversive this psychological phenomena is. So we're working together to do a bit more work on that. And the final thing I want to just present today is, this is the new direction, this is the new way forward. So at the start of the talk, I very clearly highlighted, I think, that young people were binge drinking the most. That's changed. So in the last decade, the rate of binge drinking in adolescents have gone down quite a lot. Not just in the UK, it's happened globally. The action now is with middle-aged drinkers. So according to this data from NHS Digital, 55 to 64-year-old men and 65 to 74-year-old men are binge drinking much more than younger men. And so my new PhD student, Jenna Taylor, is going to be looking at this phenomenon and trying to find out what motivates middle-aged drinking. So anyone in the audience who's curious, we might be in touch to get your thoughts later on. Shameless plug for the book, which I co-edited with Emma and Richard, and also Dominic Conroy, who was Richard's PhD student, and Martin Hagger, who I've known for a very long time from the University of Sheffield. And I'd like to thank you all for listening today. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you very much, Richard, for this interesting lecture. We have time probably for about 2-3 questions. So if there are any questions. There you go. Always can count on Chris.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Very interesting talk. I just wondered, the change in the age distribution you showed there, how much social media and the fact that everybody's walking around with a camera is putting off young people. Because I know if I had been filmed and there was evidence of me at university, I would be probably unemployed. So.
Yes, Chris, I think that's definitely part of the pattern. I think the rise of social media has definitely had an impact. There's a range of different factors. One of the most pervasive, though not psychological, is simple economics. The price of alcohol has gone up quite a lot, particularly in licensed premises, and young people, technically have become less wealthy than they used to be. So there is an issue there. The other thing I think that's quite important is potential sort of, how people get together. I think people connect online more now than they used to. We saw some evidence of this in the pandemic, that the headlines were very much like the average alcohol consumption had gone up. But what you found is there was a sort of dispersion or clustering effect, that the people who drank a lot before the pandemic were drinking more, and some of the people who were drinking socially weren't drinking at all. So their alcohol consumption had gone down. So I think how people engage in their social practices is having a big impact. So yes, thank you. You're right. It's a really good question. Thank you.
Hi, Richard. Thank you for the talk. I think it's related. Can you define alcoholism?
Well, in terms of sort of measures, quite often alcoholism will be defined as people reaching a certain score on something like the Alcohol Use Disorders Identification Test, which is usually where people will say that alcohol has control of their lives, or they find it very hard to function without alcohol. So does that kind of get at what you're asking there, by the way?
I would also add to that.
Yeah.
Alcoholism hard stop.
Yeah. Absolutely. No, that's right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Ever go and you feel like they want more all the time. You get to that person, like saving population. And what part you think more, and all of a sudden stop. Not really.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't feel good. Yes, absolutely. No, completely agree. Thank you very much. That's great. Thank you.
We have one more question here.
Sorry, it's a bit of a similar question maybe,
Okay,
because
yeah.
mine was going to be phrased slightly different, if that's okay. But
No, go for it.
because I'm also interested in alcohol as a coping strategy, but
Yeah.
would you say that any particular predictors are affected when or predictors affected by, say, trauma, which then affects the use?
Oh, yeah.
Because obviously you're looking at the intent
Yeah,
to use. So does that?
Yes, so that's a really good question. So thank you. So I talked about one specific theory, but there's obviously other theories. And one of the most popular theories outside of the UK, strangely, but certainly globally, is called the drinking motives model. And one of the key predictors in that is coping. So you've got it exactly right. So for a lot of people, coping with negative emotions is why they drink. And then, as you say, you take that a step by and say, well, what are they coping with? Is it trauma focused? Is it family, issues? So yes, so that's definitely part of the puzzle, definitely.
Thank you very much, Richard. That was a really fascinating and interesting talk. Thank you. Yes. And I'd also like to thank all of you for coming along today and making this a really interesting event. So thank you, everyone.